Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here at our webinar this evening. We have the lovely and wonderful Linda Bazinet as our instructor this evening. I'm just going to introduce myself briefly. My name is Selva Sheridan. I'm one of the program advisors with the Institute of Holistic Nutrition. And we are here with Linda. I'm going to briefly introduce Linda. We're going to talk a little bit about Linda's course very briefly, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Linda. So Linda received her Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Toronto with a specialization in zoology and a major in biomedical science. She then completed a Master of Science degree in cell biology at McMaster University. Since 1988, Linda has taught at both Seneca and Sheridan College, as well as doing private tutoring. Linda has taught in a wide variety of science courses at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, including biology, chemistry, microbiology, and the like. And we are so lucky. Linda is also one of our instructors with our continuing education program. She teaches the Applied Endocrinology course, which is some of the content that you will learn tonight. Linda has an upcoming continuing education course in endocrinology that starts on May 7th, and it runs 7 Tuesdays from 6:30 to 9:30. And if you're interested in this course, you can see the course page on the Institute of Holistic Nutrition website. So Linda, I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you all so much. And just a brief note that if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Linda.
Okay. I don't know if you want to talk at all about the endocrinology course. Actually, I thought the start date was the 18th of May. Maybe I'm mistaken. We can double check that date. Because the 7th of May is just a week from now.
Oh my goodness, no, I'm so sorry. It's May 17th.
Thank you.
17th. Okay. 17th. I was looking and I missed the one. The one. I apologize. May 17th.
And that means you've got a few weeks to decide to come and join me for 7 evenings where we talk about hormones all night, every night. And we talk about all the different hormones, from talking about growth hormone to the thyroids to adrenals and so on. So there's all kinds of interesting information there. But tonight, I wanted to focus in on not a particular hormone, but a particular, I don't know if I want to call it a health condition, but blood pressure. Blood pressure is very much affected by hormones. And so we want to do an overview of blood pressure and talk about the hormonal connection. So I'm just going to slip in here and share my screen so that you can see. I've got a slideshow for you here. Let me just get into the slideshow mode. And that's hormonal control of blood pressure. And what we're actually going to do is that we're going to start by talking about what is blood pressure, what the normal range of blood pressure should be, what are the consequences of having high blood pressure, what are the consequences of having low blood pressure, how does your body regulate blood pressure. And then we have a variety of different types of blood pressure medications. What are they? How do they work? And then, of course, we want to talk about natural ways to regulate blood pressure. And there's a long, long list of natural ways that we can control blood pressure. Now, I'm just looking here. My bar on top is not, usually that disappears for me, and it's not doing that. So let's see if I can hide floating media controls. There we go. That's better. I didn't want to have that floating on the top for you. So what is blood pressure? Blood pressure is the pressure that blood exerts against the inner walls of blood vessels. And the pressure that we have in your body doesn't stay constant. It changes. The further away you go from your heart, the lower the blood pressure is. So it's highest in the large arteries that lead from the heart, and then drops down to 0 or even negative pressure in the vena cava, the big veins that come back to the heart. Well, how can you have a negative pressure? Well, that's because when we measure blood pressure, and the typical units that we use are millimeters of mercury, That's a pressure term. When we measure blood pressure, we're not measuring absolute pressure. We're measuring pressure relative to atmospheric. So it's how much higher your pressure is compared to the environment around you. When we measure blood pressure, there's two numbers, an upper number and a lower number. The upper number is systolic, and that's the pressure at the peak of what's called ventricular contraction. That's the ventricles of the heart. Those are the big chambers that pump the blood to the lungs or pump the blood to the systemic circulation. So all the way up to your brain, all the way down to your toes. That's the strong chamber. That's the one that beats hard. And so systolic pressure is the high pressure. Diastolic is when the ventricles are relaxed. Often we're quite concerned about diastolic pressure because it's a pressure that's always present at all times. And it will vary up and down less than the systolic pressure does. Systolic pressure may be a little bit more labile, may move a little bit more easily. When we write blood pressure, we always write the systolic first and then the diastolic. So a classic blood pressure would be, say, 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. You can see here, and I want my spotlight. You can see here that when we start from the aorta, just leaving from the heart, we have this about 120 over 90. But as we go away, it's going to drop, 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 drop. Notice the further we go from the heart, we drop lower down, and then here's zero. By the time you get to the vena cava, coming back to the heart, you're actually around zero. So that is going to be the pressure that you have at the very end of the whole system. And that's quite low, but it's around the same as what's outside your body. Typically, we're going to be measuring pressure in the brachial artery. And so they say 120 over 70. You're going to keep hearing different things from different people about what ideal pressure would be. And so you'll see that we used to say 120 over 80. There you see 120 over 70. We might be happy with 115 over 70. We keep kind of revising these numbers down a little bit. So classic numbers, we would say healthy, normal, below 120 over 80. And we're going to talk a little bit about low blood pressure because that happens too. Pre-hypertension would be, say, from 120 over 80 up to 139 over 89. So borderline high is at 140 over 90. Borderline high is 140 over 90, up to 159 over 99. So high, or stage 2 hypertension, would be 160 over 100. All those numbers. I've got some more information about these, though. When we have elevated blood pressure, we increase the risk of a number of different health conditions, quite notably heart disease. And that's one of the big ones we're very worried about, but kidney disease as well, and stroke. The elevated pressure is going to damage all the arteries in the body, including, quite notably, the arteries in the heart, so the coronary arteries. Damaged arteries become hardened and weak, and then blood clots can form in the weakened arteries, and that leads to reduced blood flow and damage to vital organs. So obviously, sustained high blood pressure puts you at significantly increased risk for these conditions and others. There's some interesting numbers here. So the risk of stroke and heart disease increases as blood pressure increases. So if we say normal is 115 over 75, by the time you get to 135 over 85, your risk now is about 2 times normal. By the time you get to 155 over 95, your risk is 4 times normal. 175 over 105, 8 times normal. That's dramatic. I don't know if you've ever experienced high blood pressure. I had the I won't say joy, but I had the experience of having high blood pressure when I was pregnant. Now, sometimes you'll see people when they're pregnant, they have low blood pressure. But at the end of my pregnancy, and that's like 20 years ago, because Matt's turning 21, I had preeclampsia, or what's called toxemia, and I was put in the hospital with elevated blood pressure. Now, I'd gone to the doctor and I had a blood pressure of 140/90. It'd been normal all the way through. Then I had a pressure of 140/90. My obstetrician said, come back next week. I did. And when they took my blood pressure, I think it was 160/110, at which point I was put in the hospital. Now, they probably wouldn't put you in the hospital if you weren't pregnant, but because I was pregnant, that was very important to try to control the blood pressure, which we tried to do, not very successfully. But I just felt not quite right, a little bit not, when I stand up, just feeling a little bit, not dizzy, but just, I could feel that things were not normal. But the scary thing about high blood pressure is often you don't feel it, you don't know. That's why they call it the silent killer, because you don't know. Now, with me, with the preeclampsia, my obstetrician kept telling me there was a cure. It was delivery. After Matthew was born, I was fine, which was a good thing. My aunt, 2 years ago, was rushed into emergency with systolic pressure over 200. Systolic pressure over 200. That is immediately life-threatening. And of course, she was already on all kinds of medication. So at the hospital, they said, relax. Well, you know how that goes when someone tells you to relax. But they got things under control enough. She's in her mid-80s, and she's still with us, so she's doing okay. But clearly, elevated pressure is a big concern. But something that people don't talk about very much is the danger of low blood pressure. If you're under 90/60, we consider that to be low. And you'll also find that changes in blood pressure have a significant effect. So a drop of 20 for the top number, systolic, a drop of 20, even if you have high blood pressure, if you drop 20 points, that will cause significant symptoms as well. People with low blood pressure might feel dizzy or lightheaded. So when they stand up, they feel like they're going to pass out. And in fact, they might pass out. They can have blurred or fading vision. They can have fatigue and lack of concentration. So often, though, medical doctors say, how lucky you are. How lucky you are. You don't have to worry about those increased risks of heart disease and stroke and so on. And you're thinking, yeah, but I can't stand up. So low blood pressure can be a big concern. Some people at 90/60 feel fine. Some people at 90/60 feel really quite uncomfortable. And we'll talk at the end, towards the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about ways to increase blood pressure, because some people need to do that too. Underlying conditions can contribute to low blood pressure. So we might have what I'd call essential low blood pressure, which means there's nothing else wrong or going on. We just have low blood pressure. But sometimes people who are pregnant have low blood pressure. Some heart problems can cause this, as can diabetes, hypothyroidism, adrenal insufficiency, and other conditions as well. In fact, when we look at hypotension, so low blood pressure, there are some different types. Orthostatic hypotension is what we also call positional hypotension, which means that when you go from sitting to standing, you feel lightheaded. Postprandial hypotension, this is after eating. You can have a drop in blood pressure after eating. Well, because the blood goes to the digestive system to help deal with absorbing nutrients and so on. This happens most often in older adults, and particularly actually those who've got Parkinson's. Neurally mediated hypertension is something that happens more often with younger people. And the good news for this one is that they often outgrow this. So it can occur in children and young adults, and particularly noticeable after standing for a long period of time. This is actually a miscommunication between the heart and the brain. But as I say, oftentimes this is something that goes away as we mature. Severe hypotension, that's when you get really low. And I looked for numbers. I tried to find numbers for severe hypotension, and I couldn't find any cutoff point. But at some point, you get to the point where it becomes a medical emergency. So hemorrhage, losing a lot of blood volume, heart attack, some severe types of infection or allergic reactions can cause severe hypertension. And that severe or extreme hypertension is a medical emergency. Signs and symptoms can include being confused, pale skin, rapid shallow breathing, weak, rapid pulse. This is something that needs to be dealt with immediately because it is life-threatening. Most people with low blood pressure don't get into that situation. Usually there's something serious going on for this to happen. So let's take a look at how your body controls blood pressure. There's a number of hormones, there's other factors too, but there's a number of hormones involved in regulating blood pressure. The first is ADH. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Remember, a diuretic would make you pee. Antidiuretic, keep fluid in the body. So ADH is released by the posterior pituitary when osmoreceptors on cells in the hypothalamus detect a drop in blood pressure. Oh boy. So osmolarity is concentration. If you remember osmosis, that was when water is going to move to equalize concentrations. Osmolarity is concentrations of things like salts or proteins that don't normally cross cell membranes. So when we have concentrated blood, cells in the hypothalamus detect this. The hypothalamus is going to control the posterior pituitary. And so the hypothalamus is going to tell the posterior pituitary to release ADH, and it's going to act on the kidneys. It's going to cause the kidneys collecting ducts to reabsorb more water. So what happens with the kidney is everything gets put into the kidney tubule, and then we take back what we want to keep. And that here, in the presence of ADH, we're going to keep more water than we normally do. By increasing the water, we increase blood volume, and that is going to increase blood pressure. So ADH results in conserving water in the body and producing a very concentrated urine. If we don't have ADH, the collecting ducts and the tubules in the kidneys, pretty much impermeable to water, which means we're going to have a much more dilute urine. We're going to lose more water in urine, have less in the bloodstream. So in the presence of ADH, most of it's reabsorbed. So it has a really dramatic effect, and it has a very rapid effect. ADH acts within seconds. It will start to have actions on the kidney. If we have a lot of ADH, there's another effect. It causes vasoconstriction. So it causes the blood vessels, the smooth muscle in the blood vessel walls to contract. And that is going to cause increased blood pressure. And that's why ADH has another name. The other name is vasopressin. In some cases, your body will make very, very high amounts of ADH. So if we have a decreased blood volume, now you notice I said here 15 to 25%, that's a lot of loss of blood. Now, it might be severe dehydration, it might be hemorrhage, but that's up to a quarter of your blood. If you lose that much, then we can secrete up to 50 times the normal amount of ADH because your body's working very, very hard to keep the fluids. Because if blood pressure drops too low, well, that's a medical emergency. Alcohol inhibits the secretion of ADH. Does alcohol make you go to the bathroom? It does. Diuretics actually antagonize the effects. So they work at the kidney level, but caffeine, for example, also interferes with ADH. Does caffeine make you go to the bathroom? Yeah, it does that too. Lasix, we'll talk about Lasix a little bit later on. Lasix is probably the most commonly used diuretic, and it has a number of effects. But one of the things that it does do is does antagonize the effects of ADH. So all of these, alcohol, caffeine, Lasix, they will make you pee more and will actually lower your blood pressure. In moderate amounts, alcohol can lower blood pressure. Now, higher amounts, it has a different effect. Caffeine has other effects as well, though. So caffeine, although it does interfere with Lasix, so interfere with ADH, it has other effects that might counter that. And so caffeine does not necessarily lower blood pressure, but it does make you lose fluid. Nicotine, that's from cigarettes. Morphine and nausea increase ADH release. And I find that one interesting too. The amount of ADH that we release can actually increase 100 times after vomiting. So the idea, again, is your body's trying to compensate and make sure that you don't lose too much fluid. There is a disease state where we have too little ADH. So hyposecretion of ADH. This is called diabetes insipidus. Now, as soon as I say diabetes, you think sugar. But diabetes insipidus has nothing to do with sugar. What it shares with diabetes mellitus, which is the sugar diabetes, is the word diabetes, which actually means producing a large volume of dilute urine. You can see this is not that common. About one in, that's an interesting number, 6,666 people have diabetes insipidus. I actually came across, I did meet somebody one time who did have diabetes insipidus and had a chat with her about her health condition. In this circumstance, the individual is constantly thirsty and drinks a lot of water to compensate. Large volume of dilute urine. But depending on how severe the situation is, that might be enough. So sometimes the thirst and the drinking is enough to compensate, and we don't need any further treatment. However, sometimes it's not enough, and we have a synthetic hormone that can be used to replace ADH, and that's desmopressin, is what can be given to help replace that ADH and help try to maintain the water balance. So here we can see a lovely diagram. I'm going to get my controls. I want my spotlight again. So you can see that we've got stimulus. There's the stimulus. Increase in blood osmolarity. So blood's more concentrated. So now the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are going to release ADH, and then we're going to act here. This is the kidneys down here. So we're going to be acting on the kidneys. And the kidneys are going to keep water. You see how the water is being kept in the bloodstream? So reabsorb water, keep water in the bloodstream. And that's going to help maintain the right concentration in the bloodstream and the right amount of water in the bloodstream to maintain blood pressure. In addition, when we have those osmoreceptors triggered, we're also going to trigger that thirst reflex. So thirst is controlled by the hypothalamus, and so drinking is also going to help restore the fluid balance in the body. So that's the first of the hormones, which is ADH. But the second hormone is aldosterone. Aldosterone is the main mineralocorticoid released by the adrenal cortex. There's a whole class of hormones called mineralocorticoids, but aldosterone is the one that we talk about all the time. It's released by the adrenal cortex. So 90% of the mineralocorticoid activity is contributed by aldosterone. Surprisingly, cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, contributes because these molecules, I've got a picture of them coming up, they have some similar structure, and so they actually some crossover in terms of activity. And so cortisol is not as effective and at these mineralocorticoid activity as aldosterone is, but there's more cortisol released, so we can't completely dismiss its effects. It's interesting because ADH acts in seconds. Aldosterone takes time to act because aldosterone is a steroid hormone. Now, it turns out the steroid hormones work differently than amino acid-based hormones, which ADH is. They actually go into the cell. They turn on new genes, or turn on genes to make new proteins. And so we actually have to have new proteins synthesized, and it'll be 30 to 45 minutes before we see any effect from aldosterone. And the maximum effect might be several hours later, as opposed to ADH, which works within seconds. So these two work quite differently. I just wanted to show you the pictures of those two hormones, cortisol and aldosterone. You can clearly see, if you remember your chemistry, that they're steroids, that they have those four rings joined together, and that there's a lot of similarities between these molecules, but there are some differences as well. But it makes sense when I say that cortisol has some of the activities that aldosterone has, but not as good at it because they're not the same molecule. So aldosterone acts primarily on the kidneys, just like ADH acts primarily on the kidneys. Aldosterone acts primarily on the kidneys. What aldosterone does is it gets the kidneys to keep sodium in the extracellular fluid. So to keep it not in the urine, but keep it in our blood plasma. Now, usually the kidneys keep 80% of the sodium, but when we have aldosterone present, we keep all of it. So we keep the remaining 20%. And in fact, if we don't have aldosterone, if there's a lack of aldosterone, you can lose between 1 and 20 grams of sodium daily, and that can be very, very serious. In addition to keeping sodium, we allow potassium ion to be excreted in urine. So aldosterone means we keep sodium in the body, we lose potassium ion. It also means that we keep water, because in biology we have a saying that water follows salt, but what we really mean is that water follows sodium ion. And so wherever sodium ion goes, water is a tag along. So we keep sodium ion in the body, we keep water in the body. So aldosterone means we keep sodium, we keep water, we lose potassium. But because we've kept water, we've increased the blood volume and increased the blood pressure. Aldosterone is a very important component of maintaining that blood pressure. Aldosterone has other effects. It actually causes us to lose some hydrogen ion as well, resulting in a mild alkalosis. So a little bit of hydrogen ion is lost. It also affects sweat glands and salivary glands in the same way. So the secretions of the sweat glands and the salivary glands are likewise going to lose a little bit of hydrogen ion, lose some potassium, keep the sodium under aldosterone influence. Likewise, we're going to enhance the absorption of sodium ion by the intestines. So it's not just the kidneys, it's just the kidneys have the biggest effect on blood pressure. If we lose aldosterone entirely, you'll die, because we get a decrease in blood volume that decreases cardiac output. So increased potassium, decreased sodium chloride, decreases ECF is extracellular fluid and blood volume. The other thing is aldosterone is involved in regulating potassium. Your body needs to keep the right level of potassium, because having potassium too low or having potassium too high can both be quite dangerous. So hypokalemia is low potassium. Hyperkalemia is high potassium. Low potassium causes muscle weakness, but high potassium causes cardiac arrhythmia and can actually cause cardiac arrest. My dad had trouble with potassium. He'd had a liver transplant. His kidneys were damaged. They didn't handle potassium well. And so they had to work hard to keep his potassium level low enough that he wasn't in danger of the cardiac arrhythmia, because that could be life-threatening. Aldosterone is really important, so we have multiple ways to regulate it. We need ACTH. Now, ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. It comes from the pituitary, and it acts on the adrenal cortex. So we need it to make aldosterone. If we don't have it, we don't get aldosterone. But it doesn't have a big effect on the rate. But sodium and potassium do. Increased sodium in the ECF, again, that's extracellular fluid, is going to decrease it a little bit. But increased potassium in the extracellular fluid actually greatly increases it. Remember, having high potassium levels is dangerous. Therefore, if we have high potassium, we're going to make more aldosterone to try to lower that. My dad's problem was that his kidneys weren't listening to the aldosterone. Aldosterone secretion is inhibited by atrial natriuretic peptide. This is actually another hormone. This one's made by the heart, and we'll talk about it a little bit more very soon. But atrial natriuretic comes from the atria of the heart. Natri refers to natrium, sodium, uretic, urine. So this is a factor from the heart that puts sodium into urine, and that's because it inhibits aldosterone. Aldosterone gets you to keep sodium, AMP gets you to excrete it. The other thing we'll talk about is the renin-angiotensin system, and that has a significant, strong effect on increasing aldosterone secretion. So you can see here up at the top, stress gives us ACTH. Again, I want my controls here so I can highlight for you. So you can see ACTH from the pituitary is going to act on, this is the adrenals, to secrete aldosterone. We'll see as well that decreased sodium or increased potassium, so that one says that increased potassium, decreased sodium stimulates aldosterone. Increased blood pressure, blood volume, heart mix ANP inhibits aldosterone. And there we have the decreased blood volume of blood pressure. This is the kidney. I haven't told you about that yet. This is something called renin, which is going to cause angiotensin 2, which stimulates aldosterone secretion. So the angiotensin has a large effect on aldosterone secretion. We're going to talk about angiotensin. I just want to tell you a little bit quickly here about Addison's disease. This is something we talk about in the endocrinology course, and it's interesting because it's rare. You see 1 in 100,000. Mostly is autoimmune. In Addison's, we have hypoadrenalism. So this is a clinical form of, say, adrenal fatigue. This is one that most medical doctors will recognize. Well, medical doctors definitely do recognize. We get hyposecretion of all the adrenal cortex hormones. That means not just aldosterone, but also cortisol. But the lack of aldosterone means that we have what's called an Addisonian crisis. It is immediately life-threatening because we lose sodium ion, chloride ion, and water in urine. That means you lose the fluid in the body. So greatly decreased extracellular fluid volume, greatly decreased blood volume. Hyponatremia, that's low sodium. Hyperkalemia, that's high potassium. Remember, that can negatively affect the heart. And a mild acidosis. The plasma volume falls, the red blood cell concentration rises markedly, and cardiac output decreases. So without aldosterone, the patient's going to die in shock. And usually this happens between 4 days to 2 weeks, if not treated. But ideally, normally, we treat it. And we treat it by giving the hormone. We can actually add back the hormone, and it does work. Now, in Addison's disease, not only do we have a lack of aldosterone, we also have a lack of cortisol. The glucocorticoid deficiency causes problems too. And this is kind of a bit of an aside here, but it makes it impossible to maintain normal blood glucose. We end up with weak muscles and highly susceptible to stress. Cortisol helps you cope with long-term stress. And so while the aldosterone is the immediate life-saving portion, for people with Addison's, we actually have to give them cortisol too. One of the interesting things, and again, this is a bit of an aside, but it's so cool, I thought I'd leave it in here, that when we have Addison's, we have people with a change in the color of their skin. It's a bronze skin tone. And that's because ACTH from the pituitary is going to work hard to try to stimulate the adrenals to make their hormones, because they're not. So we're going to have higher levels of ACTH. And you see in brackets there /MSH. MSH is called melanocyte stimulating hormone. Humans don't make very much of this. In humans, ACTH is really the hormone that does it, but it stimulates the melanocytes. So in Addison's, we have so much ACTH that we have the melanocytes stimulate to give a change in the color of the skin. And it's just an interesting sign that we can see here. As I say, the treatment is to administer the hormones daily. The third system that we have, and I've mentioned this, is the renin-angiotensin mechanism. And it's going to be the kidney that gets this started. When cells of the, oh no, that's a fancy term, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, or the JG apparatus in the kidney, are stimulated by low blood pressure. If we get poor blood flow through the kidney, because we got low blood pressure, the kidney releases the enzyme renin into the blood. So renin goes into the blood. Renin is an enzyme that's going to cause the formation of something called angiotensin 2. That's actually a hormone as well. There's a few steps involved in doing this because renin actually acts on something called angiotensinogen, which is present in plasma. So this is a precursor to angiotensin 2. It's in the plasma. It's actually made by the liver, put in plasma, just waiting for renin to come along and activate it. And renin does that. It activates it to form angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1, believe it or not, goes to the lungs. And in the lungs, we have this enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. It's abbreviated as ACE, and it turns angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is quite powerful in raising blood pressure. So this happens in the lungs. Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. So it acts on the blood vessels to have the smooth muscle contract. That raises blood pressure. It acts on the kidneys directly to keep sodium in water. And we already saw that that raises blood pressure. It's a potent stimulator of aldosterone release. We know aldosterone raises blood pressure. It actually also stimulates the release of ADH. Holy cow, angiotensin does everything. The result is increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. Because angiotensin is so important in elevating blood pressure, you'll see in a little bit that it is a target of some of the blood pressure medications. This diagram, we can start on the upper left, where it says number 1, if we have dehydration, sodium deficiency, or hemorrhage, all of those can give us a decrease in blood volume. There you see number 3, that gives us a decrease in blood pressure. Now, again, I think we need the pointer. There we go. So there's a decrease in blood pressure. That's going to act on the kidneys. So here's the kidneys. And the kidneys are going to make renin. Renin, you can see, acts on the angiotensinogen made by the liver. And that's going to give us angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is going to be acted on in the lungs by angiotensin converting enzyme to give us angiotensin 2. And then the angiotensin 2 does all kinds of things. It acts directly on the kidneys. I don't think that's shown here. Because there's your vasoconstriction, and it's showing the increase in aldosterone secretion. This one doesn't show that it acts directly on the kidneys or it causes ADH secretion, but it does do those as well. But you can see the adrenals are going to release aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to have multiple effects to raise blood pressure. I just love this one because I love seeing that there are all these different organs involved in doing this, because we've got the kidney, the lungs, the liver, and the adrenals all involved here in controlling your blood pressure. There are a couple of non-hormonal ways that we regulate blood pressure as well. So we've got the baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are important for short-term regulation of blood pressure. They don't do it long-term, they do it short-term. And we're going to talk about the high-pressure receptors. They're located in the carotid artery and the aorta, and they're sensitive to blood pressure. Actually, they're sensitive to the stretching of the blood vessel. When we have high blood pressure, the baroreceptors are going to feed back to the autonomic nervous system, and that's going to activate the parasympathetic system to lower blood pressure, and it does that in a few different ways. When we've got low blood pressure, we're going to inhibit the baroreceptors, And now we're going to get a sympathetic nervous system response, and that's going to cause vasoconstriction and the release of renin. And we've seen that renin, we just saw, does multiple things to raise blood pressure. That was all connects back to the hormones. There's your atrial natriuretic peptide. We've already talked about that one. It's released by the atria of the heart when high blood pressure is detected. It acts directly on the kidneys to cause the excretion of sodium ion. It also inhibits aldosterone release and inhibits renin release and inhibits ADH release, so all kinds of things. This is going to cause blood pressure to decrease. This is color-coded, so you can see in the middle of actually, let's go on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is ADH. You can see that the hypothalamic osmoreceptors are going to detect the falling blood pressure, stimulating the posterior pituitary to release ADH, which acts on the collecting ducts of the kidneys to keep water, thereby raising blood volume and blood pressure. On the left-hand side, that's the renin-angiotensin system. Reduced blood volume or increased concentration is going to get the JG cells of the kidney to, through a few steps, cause the formation of angiotensin 2. That's going to cause the systemic arterioles to undergo vasoconstriction, but also cause the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. In the middle of the baroreceptors, baroreceptors detect the low pressure, and now the sympathetic nervous system is going to act on the JG cells of the kidney to release renin, but also cause vasoconstriction. So not everything is here, but again, kind of pulling a few of them together for you. There are some other factors that affect blood pressure. So we say blood pressure is affected by peripheral resistance. That's why the vasoconstriction, which is going to make it more narrow, raises blood pressure. So that's the first one, the constriction of the blood vessels due to sympathetic nervous system activity or atherosclerosis. Oh, if we have cholesterol deposits in those blood vessels, we're going to raise blood pressure. Increased blood volume increases that peripheral resistance. Increased blood viscosity also will increase peripheral resistance. Temperature. Oh, okay. This makes sense. Cold vasoconstricts. Heat vasodilates. Chemicals, epinephrine. So epinephrine is another hormone, kind of off. We didn't talk about that one. Epinephrine is the short-term stress hormone, and it's going to increase heart rate and blood pressure. Nicotine vasoconstricts. So smoking raises blood pressure. Now, I say here that alcohol and histamine vasodilate, and that's true with alcohol at low levels. Once you get to higher levels of alcohol, it's going to have negative effects in terms of raising blood pressure, but lower amounts can actually vasodilate and lower blood pressure. Diet, and we'll talk a little bit about diet, but salt definitely increases blood pressure. Cholesterol also can increase blood pressure. This is just looking at some of those effects on blood pressure, and you can see that the big thing that's going to be involved here is going to be the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is really, really key when it comes to regulating blood pressure. That and the hormones, of course. And so you can see we've got decreased blood volume, exercise, postural changes going from sitting to standing. All of those stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to increase stroke volume, increase heart rate, thereby increasing cardiac output, and therefore increasing blood pressure. You can see decreased blood volume. Kidneys also going to keep water, increasing cardiac output by increasing the blood volume. Chemicals like renin and nicotine cause vasoconstriction, increasing the peripheral resistance, and increased blood viscosity is also going to increase peripheral resistance. Oops, I forgot to erase. Give me just a moment. Let me erase my what I wrote. There we go. There are a lot of different blood pressure medications. The first one that many people are often put on are diuretics. Diuretics decrease blood volume, and therefore they decrease blood pressure by increasing water excretion by the kidneys. The most common by far is Lasix. Lasix is used for high blood pressure very regularly. If you know somebody who has high blood pressure and they take a medication that they call their water pill, it would be Lasix. It does interfere with ADH acting on the kidneys. It also directly acts on the kidneys to block the reabsorption of sodium ion, chloride ion, and water. So it works in a number of different ways, but one of them is to interfere with ADH. Bottom line is, on Lasix, you lose water, therefore lose blood volume, lowering blood pressure. But there can be side effects. Side effects include dehydration and electrolyte imbalance because you're losing sodium and chloride as well. Dizziness and lightheadedness often happen at the beginning, but as you get used to the medication, it usually goes away. ACE inhibitors, big class. ACE inhibitors, these drug names usually end in PRIL. So lisinopril, enalapril, I'm used to the brand names instead. Benazepril, which is low tensin. Low tensin is the one that I'm most familiar with because I have people that I know who are on blood pressure medication. ACE inhibitors inhibit angiotensin converting enzyme and therefore prevent the synthesis of angiotensin 2. So this is a very, very commonly used blood pressure medication. And one of the things that it does is it's going to have some side effects like dry cough, hyperkalemia, fatigue, dizziness if blood pressure goes too low, headaches, loss of taste can occur as well. My dad was put on an ACE inhibitor. My father had high blood pressure, but he also had kidney damage. And remember, I said a little bit earlier that he had high potassium levels. And so one of the problems was when he was on the ACE inhibitor, his potassium was just too high. Because aldosterone, we're going to stop aldosterone here by stopping the angiotensin. And it's the signal that tells the kidneys to get rid of potassium. So we had to figure it out. He had to go back to his doctor and say, could this be what was wrong? His doctor looked at him and said, oh, I didn't think of that. He gave him a standard drug, didn't think about my father's specific circumstances. You are responsible for your own care, always. By the way, NSAIDs, that's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, can decrease the effectiveness of ACE inhibitors, so something like Advil or Motrin. Another class of medication are the calcium channel blockers. These prevent calcium from entering the cells of the heart and arteries, and that actually causes the smooth muscle in the blood vessels to relax. This often ends in PINE, and amlodipine is a commonly used medication here. Side effects, they all have side effects, don't they? Constipation, dizziness, fast heartbeat, flushing, headache, nausea, fatigue, rash, swelling in feet and lower legs. Beta blockers, not the first choice, but they can be used, particularly if other medications don't work. Now, in my dad's case, they took him off the ACE inhibitor and put him on a beta blocker because he couldn't handle the ACE inhibitor. It actually blocks the effects of epinephrine and causes the heart to beat more slowly and with less force, which is going to lower blood pressure. Atenolol is the common brand name here. Side effects, always side effects, cold hands, feet, fatigue, and weight gain. So having said all that, it seems to me that we don't want the medications if we can avoid them. We'd rather do things naturally. We're going to talk a little bit about raising low blood pressure, but then I've got a few slides on lowering high blood pressure. For people with low blood pressure, salt. Salt is your friend. You want to have sodium because sodium keeps water. And you want to be well hydrated because water is going to increase blood volume and increase blood pressure. Avoid alcohol because in small amounts, alcohol does lower blood pressure. Small meals can be helpful if it's the postprandial blood pressure. So you want to have small meals so we're not having a lot of blood going to the digestive system. Also suggested sometimes to wear compression socks because we want the blood up there going up to your head, not down there in your legs. Move slowly, give your body time to adjust. And this one I came across, which I thought was really interesting, rosemary oil. Rosemary oil 3 times daily actually can be used to increase blood pressure. Most people are worried about lowering blood pressure. There are a lot of ways to do this. A lot of this is common sense. The problem is effort. The DASH diet is an American diet, but Canadian recommendations are similar. DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. This diet emphasizes fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and if you are going to have dairy, low-fat dairy. We often see a decrease within 2 weeks if people go onto the DASH diet. Not only does it help control blood pressure, it also helps to lower cholesterol. So this is just a healthy whole food diet. It can drop systolic pressure by 11 points, 11 millimeters of mercury. By the way, that's as good or better than some of the medications do. Other recommendations, and some of this go along with the DASH diet, reducing sodium. A typical intake of sodium might be 3,300 milligrams daily. If you go down, and it's pretty strict, you go down to 1,500 milligrams, but that decrease might actually give you 5 points of decrease in the blood pressure. Limiting saturated fat. Saturated fat, the connection of fat and blood pressure is not clear, but saturated fat does raise cholesterol levels, and cholesterol raises blood pressure. So it's wise to limit saturated fat, added sugars. Potassium's good. You increase potassium to in around the 3,500 to 4,700 milligrams daily range. There's lots of sources of potassium. I just listed a few there: spinach, bananas, fish, there's so many more. Increase calcium, increase magnesium. But particularly for calcium, you're better off without supplements. I was just reading an article today looking at how calcium supplements increase mortality in people with heart valve problems. So supplements for calcium might cause problems. Dietary calcium is the way you want to go. Don't smoke. Maintain a healthy weight. We always say lose weight. Not easy, but that's about a kilogram. So every 2.2 pounds or so lost might drop blood pressure 1 point. Exercise. Eat right, don't smoke, exercise, you'll do it. 150 minutes a week of aerobic activity might lower between 5 and 8 points. Again, that's as good as some of the medications. Even walking for half an hour every day makes a difference. Again, you want to limit alcohol. Large amounts of alcohol will raise blood pressure. Sleep's important. 6 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep seems to be important. If you don't achieve that, you're at greater risk for developing high blood pressure. Caffeine can raise blood pressure, so reduce caffeine. Stress. So trying to manage stress is not easy. We're all under stress. It's a pandemic. Meditation, deep breathing. Here's the interesting part. There are foods that can help lower blood pressure. Some foods containing antioxidants, like dark chocolate or cocoa. If you have 1 ounce daily, and it has to be 70% cocoa, 1 ounce can help. Berries, again, with antioxidants. Oh, I love berries. Foods containing nitrates. So things like beet juice. 1 cup of beet juice daily might decrease blood pressure 8/4. So that's 8 systolic points, 4 diastolic. Leafy green vegetables also have nitrates and also might be beneficial. Watermelon. Watermelon contains citrulline. And citrulline, it turns out, helps the body produce nitric oxide, which relaxes blood vessels and lowers blood pressure. Oats have got fiber, specifically beta-glucan fiber, and that does seem to be helpful, again, in lowering blood pressure. Other things, garlic extract. You all heard garlic lowers blood pressure. There is research to back that up. Addison, which is a sulfur compound in garlic, may increase blood flow, relax blood pressures, blood vessels. It might lower as much as 8.3 over 5.5 millimeters of mercury. So 8 points off the systolic. Cinnamon. Cinnamon, by the way, is also used to help lower blood glucose. It may lower blood pressure, again, by 6 points for systolic, maybe almost 4 diastolic. This usually only works, you get that much lowering if you have high blood pressure to begin with. Fish oil. Fish oil probably decreases systolic pressure, not as much as I thought it would. When I was doing the research for this, I thought it would have a bigger effect. It has lots of other good beneficial effects when you look at like the essential fatty acids, omega-3s, and so on. But it doesn't have as strong as effect on blood pressure as I thought it would. But they also, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, decrease cardiac arrhythmias and lower cholesterol. So they're definitely a good choice. This is my last slide, I think. Basil extract. I thought that was interesting. Basil extract contains eugenol, which actually seems to act as a natural calcium channel blocker. Parsley, in animal studies, also acted as a calcium channel blocker. Thyme, again used in animal studies, has something in it called rosmarinic acid, and it acts as an ACE inhibitor. Ginger, again, calcium channel blocker, but also ACE inhibitor. And cardamom, 3 grams daily can actually lower blood pressure by acting, again, natural calcium channel blocker and a diuretic. So the research on these natural ways to lower blood pressure is not extensive, but there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So there's so many, many ways that we can control blood pressure. And so I thought I'd share some of that with you, and I hope that you found this interesting. Hi, Sylvia, I went a little long. I'm sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. That was absolutely wonderful. You hit on some of my favorite foods. I mean, beets, chocolate. Anytime you bring up chocolate, you know us in chocolate, right? And
I collect articles on chocolate every time I find a new one.
Absolutely. So once again, Linda, thank you so much for your time, your incredible insight. IHN is so lucky and blessed to have you as part of our faculty. And thank you all so much. I wish you all a most wonderful evening, and take very good care, everyone.
Thank you very much.